Welcome to the Education Marketing Leader podcast with Chris Raposo. If you're looking to dive into the latest industry insights, draw inspiration from education success stories, or just want to sharpen your marketing skills, you're in the right place. Here, we bring you a diverse range of voices from experts and leaders in the field, offering you a unique blend of professional development and practical strategies. Whether you want to understand your audience better, stay updated with the latest tech trends in marketing, or expand your professional network, we've got you covered. So while you're driving on your morning commute or winding down after a busy day, let's explore the dynamic world of education marketing together.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Education Marketing Leader with Chris Raposo. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Robert Lee, co-founder and owner of University FM, joining us from the Motor City, USA, Detroit, Michigan. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here. Go Motor City. Go Detroit.
Go Detroit. So did a little bit of background check on you just to make sure you're the right fit for this podcast, and it looks like you are. So especially with the title University FM, that's always something that I'm particularly interested in, and our audience as well. I see that you have a degree in economics and business from the University of Michigan. Go Blue. Congratulations of winning the national championship in football recently.
Yeah, still riding the highs off of that for sure. I mean, and if you follow football, it's so sad for Detroit Lions, but hey, overall it's a good year.
Yeah, they had a good year. They'll be back, hopefully. I was rooting for them. But tell us a little bit about your journey into higher ed and what you enjoy about it and why you decided to start University FM.
Yeah. So if I go back to my University of Michigan days, I during my time as an undergrad student there, I was a part of the college radio station, WCBN FM. All right. And that's kind of my whole start in getting into audio storytelling. So while I was there, I was hosting on-air shows, interviewing local guests, doing some actual like mixing DJing on the side. So it was a ton of fun. And for one of these years, I got to this podcast fellowship program. And that was really the beginning of my journey into podcast space. And really seeing how podcasts can elevate different voices on a college campus, connecting it to the company. So University FM is co-founded, between me and my brother, Sean Lee. And at the time that I was studying at the University of Michigan, Sean was studying at UC Berkeley. So he didn't do radio, different path, but he also got into podcasting. So student podcasts, alumni podcasts, and then eventually some shows with presidents and professors. But overall, it's just this big idea of elevating the voices of different higher ed institutions.
Absolutely. So it's a good background. It gives you a lot of social proof that you've been doing it for a lot of years. So you're an expert in this. But this episode, when we planned about what we should talk about during this 30 minutes that we have together, you mentioned faculty scholarship and how to amplify faculty at a university through podcasting. So let's focus the episode on that, but let's give it a little bit of background. Some people may not know what faculty or public scholarship is. Could you begin by defining the term public scholarship, what it means in the context of higher education, and why it's crucial for universities to communicate this aspect of their work?
So in my experience, I had the feeling that public scholarship is a term that nobody outside of higher education knows. What does it mean? Some people think it's like scholarship funding, right? But really, public scholarship can think about it in terms of like research communications. So it's a term all about the act of taking relevant insights from research and making them relevant to what's happening in the world today and relevant to the general public. So public scholarship, it can be done in multiple ways. Some traditional mediums would be like having a feature in a news article, right, or a publication in a research journal. Sometimes it's being featured as a expert on a TV interview or a radio interview. So multiple ways of doing public scholarship, but all hinged on this factor of, again, bringing relevant insights from research and making them applicable to the general public. It's, my opinion, right? It's super, super important because it's so closely connected with the whole idea about how the value of higher education is perceived, right? There's so much research that's done, but not many people know about. It doesn't really get to the people that are really interested in it, right? It's not acted upon as it could be. So for us in the podcasting space, we just started realizing in our own work with different higher ed institutions that these scholar podcasts or like shows hosted by scholars have a higher audience potential than say an alumni podcast, which makes sense because okay, when you think about alumni podcasts, who's going to be listening to that? Well, it's probably just alumni, right? A little closed group. But the thing with scholar podcasts is all of a sudden you could bring in an expert who is speaking about their subject matter, and making it and speaking about in the context of what's happening today, right? It provides a lot more flexibility in what you can talk about, and you can also feature a lot of different guests to speak on their own research right, on a particular topic.
Yeah, that's a good explanation right there. And there's a couple of examples out there that people may be familiar with, like the Huberman Lab, right? Andrew Huberman, he's an American neuroscientist, and he talks about his on his show about the intricacy of neuroscience and how to apply it to everyday life. Now, if it was published in a research paper, for example, a lot of the general audience, they may stay away from that. They wouldn't want to read these pages on pages with academic language and jargon that they may not understand. On the other hand, like you said, sometimes people, they share the research on TV or in news outlets, but that's earned media and that's rented land. And it's hard to get in front of these people and get picked up. So podcasting, like you just said, is a good way to have this news, this information on owned land, like on your website, right? And then push it out to millions of people through various podcast outlets. So let's say somebody has these stellar star professors, faculty that are hidden behind the wall of the university. How can podcasts serve as an effective platform for universities to showcase their public scholarship endeavors to the broader audience to make that research more accessible?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think there's two main ways that scholars faculty can participate in podcasting. One is to actually have their own show, like Huberman Lab and Andrew Huberman, like you mentioned. The second is to be a guest on shows, and I'll talk about both of those. But before I get into that, I want to just mention when you think about podcasts as a medium, they lend themselves very nicely to public scholarship because podcasts as a medium, they are inquiry led, right? And they're conversational in tone, and they're very niche. So in the podcast space, like some of the best podcasts out there, super niche focus for a super niche community.
Mhm.
And when you think about that in terms of research that's being done at colleges and universities, no matter how specific your research is, it's very likely that you can find a podcast show that has an audience that was really, really interested in it, right? Like sometimes I just bring up a random example, like say you have a professor studying the hierarchical structure of like ant colonies, right? Super specific, but maybe that has something to do with how you organize, how you manage organizations in the business context, or maybe there's some biology component to that, right? And you just find the shows that could tie with that piece of research. So saying that, let me talk a little bit about having your own show, right? And kind of like what the benefit would be there. So the Huberman Lab, which is not a podcast produced by the way, but I think is an amazing example of what scholarly podcasts can be. They nowadays get, I believe, like 2 million plus downloads an episode, like audio and video, and in fact, like it's likely higher than 2 million. And Huberman Lab, when you look at the community that's engaging with it, there's a Reddit group, I believe, like of 200,000 members. It's all volunteer based. Like none of it's like managed by Huberman. It's just fans of the show who are actually taking the things they learn from episodes they listen to and trying to summarize them on these Reddit subreddits for others. Right? It's really fascinating. I'll go a little bit into like how the Huberman Lab or like why it started. So in reading some like interviews with Andrew Huberman,
Mhm.
like his whole purpose for doing that show was out of frustration in seeing how much health misinformation is out there in the world. And for him, it was a way to just convey better information for people that will actually be helpful for them,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
That was the whole impetus for starting this show. And I think just by knowing like now that he gets 2 million plus downloads, right, and all this audience engagement, that okay, there's also a strong public desire for this information. Um, so so that's special, right? That's really special, and it's really just shows okay, like again, there's a high potential for scholarly podcasts to support the mission of public scholarship.
Let's talk about a bit about some of the other benefits. Right now, there's a higher education is more in question than ever. The return of investment, the value of a academic degree. In what ways can highlighting public scholarship through a podcast enhance a university's reputation and demonstrate its value to society, the general public, especially for public universities that are funded by taxpayer dollars?
Yeah, so a way that I think about this question is also just maybe framing the context of how do scholarly podcasts support institutional branding, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and just going back really quickly, so like Huron Lab, it's affiliated right with Stanford University, but it's still separate. It's interesting thinking about like scholars as influencers because I don't think that's a common connection that's made, but like scholars could definitely be influencers in the public sphere, right? And just by being influencers in the public sphere and just having that association with the university or college, okay, I mean, there's definitely going to be some positive brand effects, right? Um, big picture, I think that by being able to convey and communicate research in applicable ways will is just a direct way of helping people understand the value of research, right? It's not just process of making research papers, right? It's not just doing research for the sake of research. Like there is
Mm-hmm.
some actual impact here. And I'd say, yeah, I mean the majority of people who the majority of researchers, who get into it, like yeah, they want to have a positive impact on the world, not just to have something that they've read by 20 people, right? Um, so I think the more that scholars can engage with public scholarship and in my context with podcasting, I think more often than not, it's going to be a huge benefit for universities, just conveying the value of the I guess the product, right, of what's being produced
Mm-hmm.
out of higher ed. It's I also find it interesting, to me, like research is also not the absolute answer. Like I see research as okay, based on the study, here's the conclusion, but like that may not be how the world actually is. But by sharing it in a very relevant context, it inspires some conversation, right? I think
Mm-hmm.
that's what's important. Like this research being able to inspire public discourse to actually get closer to understanding how our world works around us.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And,
Absolutely.
and to me, like I mean, that's why I went to university, right? That's the value I see in higher education, just like being able to understand how the world works around you so that you can, I don't know, be more confident, right? Or have, better informed decisions, right? Or opinions.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I see the value is.
Yeah, absolutely. So the last 10 minutes we discussed the why. Let's talk about the what a little bit, make it a little bit more practical for the listeners. Now you with University FM, you produce podcasts, the whole beginning to end, you offer that service. So you have that expertise behind it. So what are the key elements? So what elements should higher ed marketers focus on when creating podcast content that's both informs and captivates listeners about their institution's public scholarship? Like, let's say there's a listener on here toyed around with the idea of starting a podcast. They have the superstar faculty. Should they should they have the faculty member start their own podcast, or should they have a marketer be the host of the podcast and then bring in the faculty to talk on that show? What do you think is the right approach?
Okay, that's an interesting question. Well, I'll just say really quickly. So when I think about podcasts, I kind of break it up into 4 phases.
Mhm.
First phase is the strategy piece. Second is the production itself. Third is the promotion and marketing of it. And then the fourth, if applicable, will be like this monetization side to give it self-sufficient. Right. Your question is an interesting one. So it's kind of this host question. Should it be one specific, right, faculty member, or should it be like somebody from staff maybe, and the podcast is just guests of faculty members, right? I I I think the question that comes before that one is just what are the goals of the show, and also just understanding like how well does the communications goals match up with the goals of the scholars. um Broadly, at a high level, I think it's always there's like from a downloads perspective, I think it's generally more effective to have a single scholar faculty host, or just like a consistent host, because in the podcasting space, one of the things that makes it special is that people get to know the personality, right, of the show, and they associate with the person, or they associate with people much more than they associate with like a brand, right? So if you have a consistent host or consistent hosts, plural, then it's much more likely that you can build that sort of human connection for that show to be more impactful, more powerful. Now, there are definitely shows that kind of have like a staff member interviewing a variety of faculty. And in those cases, I see the kind of the communication side is thinking about, in some ways, like maybe like brand safety, or like consistency of the content, right? Um, or it may be just a factor of like, it's just easier to have a scholar in terms of planning schedules. Oh, sorry, it's easier to have a staff member as a host in terms of planning schedules.
Mhm.
So I mean, there's some practical considerations behind like who to choose as the host,
Mhm.
but I think the most important things is ultimately what is how do you define success for a podcast? Like, why does it exist? Um, and whoever you choose as the host, are you providing the proper support for them to be a successful host?
Yeah. Now, just let's say somebody comes to you, says, "Hey, I want to start a podcast with you." Talking about the strategy, what are the goals? Would you suggest, or let's say they're a smaller college that are probably going to feel the impact of the demographic enrollment cliff a lot more than a bigger school. Would you suggest that the strategy, the goal of the podcast should be awareness and communicating the value of the university? Or do you think that starting a podcast should drive enrollment? What do you think? If somebody comes in from a small Midwestern school to you, says, "Hey, we were thinking about starting a podcast. We have dwindling enrollment numbers, but we have this amazing faculty at our hands."
Well, there's different ways to go about it. I think in our experience, one way is, hey, yeah, if you had a podcast that was maybe focused on like the student experience, like if that was the selling point, and maybe that's the point here. Like what is the core message that you want to get out about your institution?
Mhm.
If it is about the student experience, and okay, it might make sense to have a show that's hosted by students, like talking relatively pretty unfiltered about their experience, right, to make it real,
Mhm.
right? But like if like the core message was the research component, depending on like maybe it's like medical school, right?
Mhm.
Then if you had star, sort of like faculty member hosting your own show, that could be very impactful as well, because it's kind of like, imagine, right, you're considering studying medicine, and then you hear about this scholar who you really admire. You really admire what they accomplish, and just want to learn about how they think about things, right? And so you find out that they have their own podcast. Fantastic. All right, you're
Mhm.
probably going to listen to it. And in the process of just getting to know this faculty member better,
Mhm.
there's a sense of, I would love to, in a way, like apprentice under this person. And that could be the main driver for somebody choosing to apply, right, to your
Mhm.
university. And oftentimes, like, hey, I mean, that outside the concept of podcast, that does happen, right? Sometimes
Mhm.
people pick. So in my context, I study economics, right? And one of the most well-known books in economics is Freakonomics, all right? And the authors of that book are professors at the University of Chicago. So, like, and I applied to U of Chicago. I didn't get in, but I applied to it. But it's like I would have never applied if I had not read that book, right? I had not
Mhm.
known these professors.
Yep.
So, and I imagine there's a similar effect with people who are considering med school, who listen to like Andrew Huberman, just to bring up an example again. Like there's definitely some younger people who are now considering Stanford,
Oh,
right? Well,
100%. 100%.
but
It's like when Jordan Peterson became big, right? In his lecture room, right? Nobody knew.
yeah,
A few people in the United States probably considered the University of Toronto to study psychology, but then he blew up
yeah,
and he has a lot of followers, right? So a lot of people may have thought, hey, maybe I want to go there, be an understudy to him as long as he's there, right? I mean, as controversial as he may seem to some um, people, other people love him. Otherwise, he wouldn't be such, a popular scholar in on YouTube. So it's always
yeah,
to look at these sort of things. Like this guy came out, all of a sudden he blew up. Now this put the university on a map, right? So this could happen if you have an outspoken faculty member on your staff that just needs to be put in front of a microphone. The other side of the coin is the This Is Purdue podcast, which is super popular now, where Kate Young is the host. She's a member of the marketing staff. She's not a professor, but she brings in some incredible alumni on their show. And I'm sure that a lot of people, especially in the state of Indiana, are very proud of that show, and they're probably going to consider Purdue University as their go-to institution, right? So if you manage these podcasts right, you can put a spotlight on your institutions like nothing else, especially in the digital world where things go viral like crazy, right? But if it's just cut and dry, nobody's going to want to listen to it. So can you discuss the importance of storytelling and podcasting and how it can be used to bring academic research to the public through public scholarships and bring those stories to life?
there's, I won't name any names, but like there's a lot of higher ed podcasts out there that maybe publish a few episodes and they just stops, right? And when you listen to the episodes they put out, I mean, there's a few things to think about. Uh, Even before getting to the storytelling, the first is like the quality of the audio recording, right? Like can somebody actually bear like listening to the quality of the audio? Um, Second, I think is around this sure, like this host perspective. Like the hosts, are they dry, right? Are they like the questions they ask, like are they just like very, very high level, like surface level, or do they get a little deeper, right? And like when they ask questions, does it sound like they're just reading off the script of questions, or are they actually listening and asking proper follow-up questions, right? So there's a hosting component to it. And then I think there's a guest selection side too, right? Some one, some factors maybe, does this guest, I think most people will think, okay, does this guest have a proper, like a big following themselves? But I find that that's not the most important thing, because even if you have a guest who has a huge following, they may not just be good talkers on a podcast.
Mhm.
And in this research context, like that's a common scenario where and this is an important distinction. Like some of the best scholars, right, who highly respected within their own fields and their own realms, if they're a really top scholar, does not necessarily mean that they're a top communicator.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you get into like research communications, it's really important, uh, either in the prep process, right? If the like speaking doesn't come naturally, to work with these brilliant scholars to help them convey their ideas better in simpler terms,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so going back to your original question around like the importance of telling, so these are a few factors to consider even before going into like story structure, right? But yeah, it's important that the audio quality is good enough. It's important that you have a good host on a good guest who have a pretty good like social dynamic, right? And that's the ideas that are being communicated or communicated in a way that are simplified, right? So that the average
Mm-hmm.
Joe can understand, right? And
Yep.
see how it's relevant to them. And then when we get to the storytelling structure, okay, I mean that's interesting. And that's a whole other conversation, right? It's kind of like simply put, there's two main models. One is you have a host interview format, right, which is kind of like what we're doing right now. We're just
Mm-hmm.
talking to each other. The other is if you have a narrative format, so where you actually interview multiple people and you try to stitch together a cohesive story, and that's what you would hear on like a high level like NPR production, right? Um, but even then, to me, storytelling, probably the most important thing is you have a really good understanding of your audience for your show, for your podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And with the understanding, like how the tone of the show should be.
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay, here are the points that like our listeners would find interesting, right? So it kind of so before the storytelling conversation, it has to start with a very, very good understanding of who our listeners are. And
Mm-hmm.
if you don't know, then having a very, very good definition of who is our target listener.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. You brought in a good point there with the audience. You got to know your audience, and we have to understand that this show is not about you, about your guests. It's about the audience that you're serving, like with anything in communications. And then when you mentioned the equipment, having a good mic because you are in people's ears to make sure that it's pleasant to listen to and don't have a lot of background noise there. And then I just want to make sure that people don't get scared off that this does not cost a lot of money, right? Like my podcast setup, my camera, my mic, and my little mic handle is around $200, right? You can get started with that. So it doesn't have to be a big undertaking. Now, of course, if you can monetize your show, you can start outsourcing things as well. If you have a podcast. Also, I like that you mentioned the guest selection, right? A lot of people fall into this trap wanting to have having a guest with a big following so they get in front of more people. But let's say you have an egotistic guest that makes it all about themselves and not about the audience, just to promote themselves further. I can tell you the number of times I've received LinkedIn messages from people that had nothing to do with my audience that just wanted to go on a podcast, right? So you have to be selective with that as well because you can sniff them out if they're self-promoting and they're like, I'm asking like, well, did you even check out my podcast? Because I serve the higher ed marketing community and you have no background in higher education. So I'm not sure that you would be the right fit for this show, right? You got to be selective in that because at the end you serve your audience, you don't serve the guests.
Yeah. And if I can just connect that to scholars again, right? Um, some scholars just really love to talk, right? They really love to talk about their research and what they're working on, right? And there may be this scenario where they may not even recognize it, but they're really like talking a little bit too much about themselves, right? But not on purpose. It's just they're just so passionate, right, about getting the details of what they were doing. Um, and there's I think when it comes to scholar communications, research communications, there's probably this element of like media training as well. right? Um, for people who have never, yeah, had a public appearance, just be able to give them the guidance, for a good feature. There's a lot of scholars. And again, a lot of scholars who great researchers, not so good as communicators. And part of it is just because they don't have that much experience with it. They probably haven't thought about communications that much. Recently, as in this past January, we launched Professors FM, which is a podcast network for scholar hosted shows. And the whole purpose of Professors FM is directly tied to public scholarship with podcasts. And for us, what we want to achieve is making it as easy as possible for scholars to get into this podcasting space, whether, having their own show or as guests on other shows. So I just bring it up because one of the things we're working on is, very specific media training for scholarship, for podcasts. And, working on that in collaboration with Emory University's Public Scholarship Center. And then the second thing they're trying to do is, hey, if you're looking to have your own show, then supporting with the strategy, production, promotion, and ultimately monetization of the show. So that's, this is my world right now, all right, for the foreseeable future. just seeing how we can enable more podcasts in this public scholarship space, so that bigger picture, okay, yes, it elevates the branding of higher education, right? It does, make the work of researchers more important, right? More forefront. And ultimately, I think it'll be a great benefit to society to inspire discussion.
Absolutely. And right now I'm going to put another plug in for University FM. I would highly recommend everybody following you guys because you put out some great webinar content. Just last month, you had a podcast on how to grow your podcast audience with Kate Young, the host of This is Purdue, and you got one coming up on how to engage faculty with podcasting. That's pretty timely as well. So, but as we wrap up the episode, let's just briefly talk about common challenges universities might face when starting a podcast focus on public scholarship, and how can they address these challenges?
Yeah, I think one aspect that's not commonly thought about is the scholar hesitancy to participate in podcasts. So it is interesting. As higher ed communicators, scholarly podcasts just make a lot of sense to do, right? But from a scholar side, there's some very, valid and real concerns they have. One being, okay, if I go on a podcast, what happens if I get it wrong, right? What happens if I say the wrong thing, right? Or something around, I don't want to be like a salesperson for the university, right? That's not my role, my job. And a slew of other reasons. And so in the podcast context, it's just being able to frame podcasting and its benefits to scholars. So if I use the two examples that I just gave, if you say something that you think is wrong, hey, it's okay. Like, podcasts are recorded, right? You can do the post-production and like take it out, right? There's some flexibility there. Um, and 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 so actually, just like, because I know we're tight on time, but I'd love to share something they can put in show notes that is like a chart, a very simplified chart of common scholar hesitancies, and then how podcasts can kind of be a remedy to them.
Absolutely.
But
You send it over, I'll share it.
yeah, fantastic. But yeah, I mean that's the aspect that's not commonly thought about. Podcasts make so much sense to communicators, more hesitancy on the scholar side, but I think once you convey it the right way, scholars are totally on board. And I'll just use one more example. So just by being on more podcasts, you build up your media kit, your media profile, and like that builds up the social proof in a way for any other work that you do, right? Like on this upcoming session, this live session webinar that we're doing, it's with Ken Carter, who's from Emory University, and he's done podcasts as guests and also hosted his own. And he was saying that, one of the books that he was publishing, which is called, Thrill Seekers, initially, like, no publishers would take it. But after being on more podcast interviews and just having that support the case for his following, right? Cambridge University Press, picked it up, right? So there's definitely some side benefits to podcasting. Just by sharing your research in this public way, it helps you do your other work.
Absolutely. And there's something in it for the scholar as well. If they continuously show up, eventually they're going to get picked up. They're going to build trust because they're always around. People recognize them, and then they become the expert in their field that they ultimately want to be. Why else would they be in the seat that they are? And the benefit of having your own podcast is, even though you may say something that may change and it be outdated in a couple of years, you can always go back if it's on your own land and say, hey, let's edit this out, or let's redo this or that, so that there shouldn't be any hesitation if you're running your own podcast, because you can go in there and just edit it yourself, right? So if there's hesitation from the scholar side, you can always say, hey, this is living, breathing document, and we can always update that or remove it from the channels if things in the research world change. We want to make sure you're as seen as the expert that you are.
Like podcasts, I think, are one of the best means of putting scholars in the best light.
Exactly. So highly recommended as well. Well, Robert, this brings the episode to a close. I really appreciate all the insights you shared today with me and the audience, and I'll be sure to tag you in the recap so people can find you, follow you. But if it's not on LinkedIn, how else can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, so my email, right, is just robert@university.fm. And otherwise, I think, if you go on university.fm, which is our website, and professors.fm, then you can reach out to us there too.
Perfect.
And I'll be the first person to get back to you.
Awesome.
So,
Awesome. Robert, thank you, man. I really appreciate your time today.
yeah, thank you, Chris.
All right. Take care. Hey, thanks so much for tuning into the show today. If you enjoyed it, don't keep it to yourself. Share with your friends in your network. And if you have a moment, I would really appreciate a review of the podcast. That'll help other people find the show as well. Tune in every Thursday morning at 8 a.m. when I release another episode. Take care now. Have a good one, friends.